Here is Monteverde Peace, a beautiful, vivid, dark blue. The chromatography shows some purple undertones that show just a little bit of shade, or just a little bit in the shading of the writing sample. This gives a very consistent tone as paper changes, making this a very predictable ink to use, and it always gives some shading to purple in the darker spots. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, the look of the ink is solid, but it does tend to get aggressive, getting very deep into the paper, making this not the best choice for student use. Now, I certainly would use up a bottle if I was given it, but I don't see myself buying a bottle of this.
The pen for today is a Kaweco 475. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Definitely a beautiful dark blue on the page that doesn't feather, doesn't spread, does shade. You see that slight purple undertone that goes on in the darker areas of the shading. In that, on the first line, it shows a bit more in the T, the last T, and the H, even though the first T and A are quite dark as letters. Therefore, on the third line, it tends to show everything from its darker tones to its lighter tones that we see with the or towards the end. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Monteverde makes more than just one ink, so let's take a look at a few other inks from Monteverde.
Here is Monteverde Rose Pink. Here is Monteverde Mandarin Orange.
Here is Monteverde Gratitude. Here is Monteverde Lion.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does show a little bit of shading. Almost went without it, but look at almost on the second line where the A is a little bit darker than the whole rest of the word. Mostly, it's not shading very much. You get a lot like finished right next to that where it's all one uniform darker tone. Looking at the back of the page, now the ghosting's not a problem, but it does get fairly deep into the paper very regularly, meaning you probably could not write back here for fear of ruining both sides of notes, showing just a little bit of aggression here.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we get the same darkness as the Clairfontaine, really showing as a bolder blue on this toned paper. I believe it to be affected by the tone of the paper and what we're seeing, meaning it is a slightly translucent ink. We have no feather, we have no spread. We do have shading going on very well, completing the cycle. Look at completing on the third line, where the C is darker than the OM. The pli gets quite a bit darker. That T lightens a little bit with a darker ing at the end. Looking at the back of the page, once again, we can see the aggression and it gets deeper into the paper. It never bleeds through to touch the page underneath. The ghosting's not out of control, but this probably might stop someone like me from writing on the back of the page.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does shade the same as the Clairfontaine, meaning we have a darker blue that shades to an even darker blue, and we get to see some of those purple undertones, so it's doing a great job with the coated paper. It stands out against this quad rule with no kind of problem whatsoever, allowing the quad rule to melt into the background after you've used it. Looking at the back of the page, we have no ghosting, but I'm going to circle it so that it is more obvious for you. There are a few spots that you see it more aggressive, deeper into the paper. Now, none of this bled through and touched the page underneath, and the spots are tiny, so they probably would not stop you from writing back here, but it is something to be aware of.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more blue inks that are out there.
Here is Ackerman, their number 8 Deep Water Blue. Here is Diamine China Blue. Here is Dr. P.H. Martin's Ocean Blue. Here is Noodler's Bad Blue Heron.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Now, it's not lighter, but it is slightly flatter as the tone. Not a problem, just a result of the paper. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade very well through most of the writing. It probably shades better here than it did on most of the other papers. It also continues to stand out against the quad rule with no problems whatsoever. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, showing this is a great ink for students.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Sailor Studio 131.
Here is Mont Blanc Ink of Joy. Here is Sailor Zodiac Aries. Here is Califolio Horidori.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here the tone is just a little bit lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine, definitely showing as a much lighter blue. It doesn't feather. It does have a slight bit of spread. The spread's not any kind of a real problem. I'm going to take back the feathering because look at reiterate here on the second line, though it's not really a huge problem. Neither the feather or the spread. You can probably use this without any kind of real controversy over using it. They're not going to say that, well, you just shouldn't use fountain pens with this. No, it looks fairly good. There is little bits of shading going on. Look at what on the second line and compare it to following on the third line, where following shows shading throughout and what, for the most part, at the hat, very dark, the W a little bit lighter. Looking at the back of the page, we get no ghosting, but we do get a little bit of aggression, getting a little deeper into the paper. Not a problem considering that it's copy paper, but just don't expect to write on both sides.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The very wet Vintage Flex nib in this Kaweco 475 gives a dark blue that shades to a dark blue with a kind of purple lean. Now off camera, I tried this in a dry medium. The tone lightened a lot and shaded just about the same, though the purple undertones were more obvious. Now, I didn't really care for it showing as a blue with very obvious purple undertones, so I go for a wet fine or wet medium nib to get the darker blue that only shows the purple lean in the darker spots of the shading.